A conservative who stopped supporting actual conservative ideals is rightfully called a cuckservative. A leftist who stopped supporting actual leftist ideals is now called a regressive leftist. There is a pressing need for a similar term for libertarians who stopped supporting actual libertarian ideals. How about a LOLbertarian? Seems appropriate since what these cucks say is usually laughable. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. For over a decade now, the professional libertarian ideologues have been predicting a libertarian moment, which of course hasn't happened, or better said, hasn't happened the way they predicted it, because otherwise it kinda did happen. There is far more awareness today than 15 years ago about, let's say, stupid laws. Stupid laws are also quietly broken and de facto abolished. And in the United States, there is even a movement called the Leave Us Alone Coalition, spearheaded by Grover Norquist, but whose intellectual platform is better expressed by Charles Murray, who also got several lawyers to work on finding ways to get the state out from the people's business. Charles Murray's worldview also started yielding results, and civil disobedience against retarded law is now on the rise. Now add to that the increased legalization of harder drugs, the de-emphasizing of hardline policies against drugs, the explosion of alternative thought around the state-approved consensus, and you can actually make the case that there is a libertarian moment. It's just that it's not the way the professional libertarians imagined it. Now the professional libertarian ideologues imagine the libertarian moment as a political revolution where a significant chunk of the populace would simply start adopting a more liberty-oriented worldview. Now, that may have been possible, but one of the main reasons that did not happen, and will not happen anytime soon, is the overrepresentation of LOLbertarians. So, what is a LOLbertarian? Well, LOLbertarians are those who insist that they are libertarians, yet when it actually matters, they fall on the authoritarian side. One such example is Gary Johnson, whose sole real argument in his race for the Libertarian Party nomination is that his two competitors are even worse than he is. When asked about freedom of association, which starts with the freedom not to associate, Gary Johnson sounded like any other social justice warrior. According to, I repeat, the libertarian frontrunner, you don't actually own your business, but the state does. According to Gary Johnson, you should be forced at gunpoint to serve customers you don't like. You're a Jewish bakery asked to serve a Nazi event? Tough luck. You can't say no under the libertarian rule of Gary Johnson. With such libertarian representatives, who the hell needs enemies? Another example of LOLbertarians are those who insist that closing your border and protecting your nation is bad in itself. When I hear such argument, I usually ask them if they would be willing to take in 20 million Marxist-Leninists into their own country. Most of them suddenly realize that 20 million hardline Marxist-Leninists would fundamentally alter their country, and not in a good way. Now, mind you, there are libertarians who can't even see the problem with importing 20 million Marxist-Leninists, and those that can't see that are just too far gone into the LOLbertarian abyss, and quite frankly, I pity them. The fact of the matter is that borders are not a modern construct. Even anarcho-capitalists believe in borders of their own property, even if with the purpose of always knowing where one's property ends and the next man's property begins. In fact, for anarcho-capitalists, the question of immigration would be solved at an individual level since public space doesn't exist and everything is owned and operated privately, so the owners would settle the question and then be rewarded or punished by the wider market depending on their decisions. But we don't live in that world. We live in this world where nations exist, where cultures are not equal, and where such thing as the public space still does exist. A libertarian formulating policy on this issue, or any other issue for that matter, has to first and foremost acknowledge reality and then, and only then, start formulating policy that is the most consistent with liberty. In fact, this should be the case with all political positions. For instance, the leftist position of triggering trade wars around the world in the name of bringing back the jobs may be entirely wrong and would likely have the exact opposite result, but at the very least, that position starts with an acknowledgement of reality. LOLbertarians, however, routinely dismiss or ignore reality. And this is particularly endemic on Reason TV, which spends resources creating emotionally appealing videos about receiving refugees, whilst totally and utterly ignoring any aspect of the actual reality of that topic. We could also toss into the bucket of LOLbertarians those who consider themselves libertarian, but then suddenly turn around when it comes to cutting non-essential spending. This category of people has been identified decades ago by Milton Friedman, who once said that everyone is in favor of cutting government spending, provided that it starts with the other guy's entitlements and not with his own. In this category fall the libertarians who favor state subsidies for churches, or some weird notion of subsidies for scientific research or education, which they otherwise condemn as statist, and so on. And mind you, I refer here specifically to subsidies, not to tax breaks. Tax breaks are fine because they're a reduction of theft. Another example of LOLbertarians are those who insist on cutting military spending or even abolishing the military. Now, while it is understandable in the case of the United States, whose military is quite a bit wasteful and a reform to limit spending may be in order, provided that it's well thought out, I have a lot more contempt for the European libertarians who complain about military spending. Seriously, we in Europe need to triple our military spending today. The average military spending as percentage of the GDP in Europe today is below 2%, with only Ukraine, the United Kingdom and Estonia spending 2% or more. The average should be at least 4.5%. At the end of the day, it is the job of the government to provide for national defense, but it's not the job of the government to subsidize, let's say, the film industry, or including the foreign film industry, as France does. One of the reasons we want smaller government is precisely because the government tries to do too many things at once, and it fails on a massive scale. So it should do fewer things. And again, arguing for cuts in the military spending in Europe shows a complete and utter disregard for the actual reality on the continent. The Calais region of France is still under siege right now. I mean, this is a war. Cutting the military even further right now is simply not a good idea. Another category that I would include in the LOLbertarian tent are those aptly called on Facebook as confused pro-Putin libertarians. Now, I tend to have a bit of sympathy for some of them. I mean, they don't speak Russian, they've never been to Russia, they have no idea what Duginism is, which I hope I will get to explain this month as well. Stay tuned on that. And generally, they form their opinion from whatever Sputnik News, RT, and other Kremlin-funded outlets feed to them in English. I've had a libertarian argue to me that Putin is the only one standing for socially conservative values on the international stage, which is laughable for anyone who has actually been to Russia, studied the ideology that drives the Kremlin right now, and generally knows a thing or two about how Russian politics actually work, as opposed to how disenfranchised social conservatives think it works. In reality, Putin doesn't give a flying toss about any values of any kind. What he does care about is power, so he will support anything and everything that could potentially bring him more power. So while gullible Europeans see him as a savior of Christianity, the number of mosques in Russia has grown spectacularly. roughly one mosque per day was built in Russia since Putin took the helm. The most recent spectacular act of dimitude was last September when Comrade Putin, joined by Islamist extremists of Hamas and neo-Ottomanists of Turkey, personally blessed the opening of a huge mega mosque in Moscow. Also, when gullible Europeans don't look, Putin wins more power by pandering to the Islamists even further. The most spectacular act in this regard still remains his statement that there is more in common between Orthodox Christianity and Islam than it is between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism. I mean, one doesn't have to be a theologian to know that this is very far from the truth. Now, I can understand the authoritarians supporting Putin. I mean, at least they're being consistent and they're making a legitimate argument, even though I disagree. But libertarians outright ignoring the hardline authoritarianism of Putin and taking the bait of the Kremlin's pandering, that's worthy of being in the bucket of LOLbertarians. Because it's laughable to be aware of these things and yet still conclude that Putin is some sort of a freedom-loving leader. Another category of LOLbertarians are the so-called left libertarians, who come in different shapes, sizes, and tastes, but as far as I'm concerned, they're all LOLbertarians since one way or the other, they hold multiple positions that are outright laughable. Left libertarians are all for what they call social freedom, whilst at the same time advocating for various degrees of economic socialism. But how can you have social freedom without the economic means to actually exercise them? I mean, yeah, sure, marijuana is legal in North Korea, so certain social freedoms are not dependent on economic freedoms. But many social freedoms are dependent on economic freedoms. For instance, how can you have brothels without economic freedom? Some left libertarians are for banning prostitution outright, which is not surprising since it's almost always the left who is willing to bring in the violence of the state on this topic, but those who are for legal prostitution have yet to explain how a society can have minuscule economic freedom whilst at the same time having legal prostitution. Another example is gambling. I mean, how can you have the social freedom to gamble without a market? In Europe, gambling is quite unregulated and allowed, but in the United States, it's the right who is against it. But at least the right-wing authoritarians who impose draconian legislation on gambling are honest. They're against gambling because they think it's immoral and the trade-off in economic and social liberty is worth it. Now, I disagree entirely with them, but at least they're taking a legitimate and consistent position. But left libertarians are really LOLbertarians on this topic. If you're really all for social freedom, then why can't I gamble? Another example is freedom of expression. Left libertarians are all for freedom of expression provided that nobody is offended, which pretty much means that no expression is actually free. The actual libertarian position is that speech is free within the legitimate boundaries of property. That means I say whatever I please on my channel, in my newspaper, on my blog, and so on and so forth, while you get to say whatever you please on your channel, in your newspaper, on your blog, and so on and so forth. The actual libertarian position provides room both for those who want to avoid being offended for whatever reason, and for those who want to offend. The so-called left libertarian position doesn't, which makes them laughable, hence LOLbertarians. One final category I would include in the LOLbertarian tent is the pedantic pricks. You probably all know the type. It's those who debate the minutiae of politically inconsequential things in a never-ending circle jerk. Now that in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Debating the minutiae of things can be entertaining or thought-provoking. But when this practice becomes a problem is when this practice is the only actual engagement in politics. What I mean by that is that libertarians aren't nearly as quick as other groups to insert themselves at the forefront of political conversation. And this, in my view, is because of the abundance of LOLbertarians who spend a large amount of their time discussing things that the overwhelming majority of the population doesn't care about and should not care about. For instance, libertarians spend a disproportionate amount of time discussing central banks and conducting comparative analysis between fiat currency and decentralized blockchain currencies. Yes, I admit it's a very interesting topic, but who in the general population cares about that? I mean, ask 1,000 random people on the streets of any city what's their position on this topic. The most likely answer is, what's fiat currency and what's a blockchain? If that time would be spent lobbying for things that the general public understands and for which there already is a silent majority, a lot more progress would be achieved. And I don't mean just governmental lobby, but also societal lobby. I mean, look, libertarians have been lobbying against central banks for what, 40 years now? There's still nobody outside of the libertarian circles, and the central banks of course, who actually even understands the libertarian position on this, let alone agree with it. However, the libertarian meme "taxation is theft" has been far more successful, up to the point where the leftists have to do mental gymnastics when pushing higher taxes, because they have to also admit that taxation is theft at the end of the day. These days, many libertarians spend a tremendous amount of time arguing with conservatives over the immigrant crisis, instead of focusing on an issue that could actually unite more people and advance the cause of liberty. An example of such an issue is freedom of expression. When you have Germany and Britain raiding homes for un-PC speech about progress, diversity, youth violence, and multiculturalism, the libertarians should be at the forefront of that issue. Yet, they're not. It's still the conservatives who do the heavy lifting on this. Alright, I think that's enough for now. So, what do you guys think? Am I being too harsh on certain libertarians here? I mean, I think I'm rather pulling my punches, but I could be wrong. So please do tell me in the comment section below. Also, this video will probably air when I'm off the map, so I'll be slow to answer the comments, so please don't think I'm not reading them, because I do. It's just that I'm on an improper connection, and that's when I might have difficulties in answering. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.